Recording. Well, hi. As you all know, my name is Senya. I wanted to, just as I'm, kind of toward the end of wrapping up my time here at Light, at least for the time being, I've been, contemplative, and I wanted to leave you with a more contemplative presentation, and something I've been thinking a lot, which is art as therapy in the grieving process. Um, at first, this presentation started as a review of the merits of using art therapy in the grieving process. And I will talk about that a little bit. But for me, it goes so much deeper than that. And I think I would be betraying my own conscience and my own perspective to not acknowledge those less official aspects of it. And especially because the therapeutic potential of art shouldn't just be relegated to clinical settings. Um, right. It should be individual. It should be communal. It should be for everyone. So I'd like to talk about art's broader role as a medium for the grieving process. My goal is to not teach you how to do art therapy, but more to raise a deeper interest in it, in case you are interested, and explore how its principles can be incorporated into social work practice. Because if you are an MSW and want to be an official art therapist, I apologized, but the accreditation board says you're lame and you have to go and get a different degree, other than social work. But that does not mean you cannot use these principles in your practice. So, with that in mind, I think a really important question to start off with is what is art? There are entire university level courses and countless pages of literature exploring this idea. But for the sake of my argument, I want to operate on this first definition, which is art is any abstract creation communicating an internal experience. I want you to just keep that definition in mind as we talk about this. Um, and to clarify, by abstract, I mean it in the traditional sense of the term, not in the pop cultural sense, which means basically to take something from its original source and re-articulate it. Um, um, and in my from my perspective, art sort of like defines humanity, as does our awareness of loss, which is why art is so important and is so often used to express and process grief. Throughout my whole life, I've heard people say it's being conscious that makes us human, but I disagree with this. I believe other non-human animals have consciousness as well, even if it is different from ours. Many of the most visceral emotions that we associate as being fundamental to the human experience, such as lust, fear, attachment, and even grief, are all experienced through parts of the brain that we share with other animals. But what makes us distinctly human, rather, is our limitless and diverse capacity uh, to be creative and to express ourselves creatively. The only argument I can really see as being valid for consciousness um, has to do with the difference in our awareness of loss, in how we experience grief. We as humans ruminate over and over again and anticipate loss so vividly that we end up grieving before it's even happened, before anything's gone wrong. And art and modalities that utilize art can be just as effective for anticipatory grief as they can be for other forms of more acute grief. Right, there are a million different ways that someone can communicate the idea of I am in pain, I feel lost, I feel loss. And um, there's a lot of research to suggest that community-oriented approaches to addressing grief are effective. And I think that's very much in line with part of Light's philosophy, that if art communicates, then it stands to reason that art can be an excellent vector for processing grief. Um, the most useful thing I was ever told when I first started casework was all behavior is a form of communication. If this idea holds true, in addition to using the definition of art as communication, I think it stands to reason that our artistic process and creative behavior communicates something just as much as the thing that we've actually created. Um, and I think this, from what I've read into, and even from my own personal perspective, is at the foundation of art therapy. Um, so why art therapy specifically? It is a discipline within psychotherapy that incorporates artistic expression to achieve therapeutic goals. It has its roots in psychoanalysis, but at some point eventually branched off for that. There was some literature I can provide on that at the end. Our capacity to express is as universal as our capacity to feel, and we will all feel grief at some point. However, we don't always understand what we're feeling and how to process it, especially if is involved. And the fundamental principle of art therapy is that it works because it becomes a form of symbolic speech, which leads to an increase in the verbalization in the course of therapy. In essence, as I go through the artistic process, I have an easier time describing what I'm feeling, describing how I want to feel, describe what has happened to me. And that idea was coined by someone named Margaret Nomberg, who's sort of considered the mother of art therapy. And if you actually read into her biography, I highly recommend it. Considering she lived from 1890 to 1983, she saw so many changes, not only through the field of psychotherapy, but through the art world as well. And her work is extremely foundational and important in many different fields. Um, and as I, mentioned before, another idea to keep in mind, along with the definition of art as a way of communicating an internal experience, all behavior is a form of communication, including the artistic process. So a little bit about how art therapy is more distinct from other modalities. Um, Making art isn't always stress free, but neither is therapy or the process of going through it. It can be frustrating and grueling at points. Progress isn't linear. And it's the responsibility of the clinician to foster an environment where a client that is otherwise stuck, for lack of a better term, feels safer in taking the emotional risks necessary to find peace. And art can be an excellent way to step into those emotional risks in a way that feels safer than it otherwise would. Um, and with that in mind, one way in which art and therapeutic modalities in art cross over well with social work is in something called photo voice. For those that might not be familiar, photo voice is it's a research method that is used very frequently by social workers, where in order to analyze particular issues affecting a population or community, they will have them participate in photography projects where you give them cameras and say, okay, here is your prompt. We want you to document this aspect of your life. And then those photographs are often captioned or given a voice by the people who took them. and then it is analyzed by research. So it's highly inclusive for that reason and why it's preferred by social workers. And um, the photos that I provided here are actually from a photo voice study that was done originally to examine the effects on that people who underwent mastectomies during cancer treatment, how it affected their body image. But what was very interesting is that the overwhelming majority of photos didn't have anything directly to do with body image. They had to do with all of these smaller aspects of life that were affected by their grief um, throughout treatment, such as one woman who picked up the habit of smoking. There's a sink full of dishes that discussed the sort of this sense that not only have I lost this part of my body, but I've lost an ability to look after myself. Um, or losing your hair through something like chemo. But there were also photos of landscapes, not just ones that communicated an internal experience of despair, but also one of joy. And you can see that in the contrast between a naturescape and an abandoned building that were taken. And in the bottom left-hand corner, an art piece, because a lot of the women in the study turned toward creative expression in order to process things, which was not, again, not part of the prompt outside of photography itself. Um, and so to summarize that section, art's therapeutic nature can make it easier to connect with communities and cultures that may have an aversion to the more pathological nature of traditional therapeutic modalities. Especially with those in who might be a part of a marginalized community. Sort of this medical model that so many of us are used to sort of taking at face value, which often reflects a more Eurocentric or Western philosophy of medicine and healing. Um, for anybody who's interested, and again, I have links to this, there is an excellent essay written by someone called, and it's called Life Story of an Art Therapist of Color, that are reflections from a Black woman who became an art therapist in an attempt to provide better care to people in the inner cities and her ups and downs with that process. And luckily, the merit of art as a therapeutic modality itself, even beyond traditional art therapy, is starting to become more accepted and popular. So here I just have a list of some major organizations that do this: Prison Arts Collective, Red Pencil, Artolution. I found one that's more local called the Colorado Art Therapy Association. But these sorts of exercises are also being implemented in areas that don't just directly have to do with art. For example, I work a little bit with the Center on Colfax, and a lot of the programs that they have for both queer youth and elders have to do with creative and artistic projects. So just to get a bit more contemplative again, I want to talk about art as memorialization, rationalization, and subsequent release in the grieving process. Artistic depictions of grief allow that grief to be seen in a way that makes us feel comfortable or to help others understand. In essence, it helps us to feel less alone. Um, Exploring our grief through an artistic lens can also help us memorialize what we've lost and is often an important step in the healing process. Um, Creative embodiment of this is not only therapeutic as an object, but again, as a process. Um, a good analogy that I have here is if somebody painted a portrait of somebody that they loved after they died, the painting is to the headstone as the act of painting is to the funeral. Both processes are equally important. And in some sense, a sort of catharsis can be achieved by processing loss artistically. But there is research to suggest that creative expression of loss can slow emotional recovery depending on the type of loss that it is, especially in the cases of broken relationships, or if somebody has experienced acute trauma. And I think if we are to approach this or incorporate it into our practices through a trauma-informed lens, it's incredibly important to keep that in mind, that this is not always appropriate in every instance for everybody, and it still has to happen on a client's terms. So the incorporation of creative expression should be treated with caution. And one way to sort of smooth the entry into this process for someone who may be interested but is a little apprehensive is to acknowledge that someone does not have to fixate on their suffering when they are creating art in order to achieve the benefits of that. This is demonstrated in how often people pick up crafts when they are stressed. It isn't just the active reflection and contemplation that is happening that makes art beneficial. It is the act of creating itself and how that can help make us wholly present. And so that sort of transitions into directing this more at all of you and how art therapy and art in general can help you. Being a clinician or a caretaker or a community leader is not easy. And like in our roles, we not only risk internalizing the grief of our clients through phenomenons like vicarious trauma. We also experience our own grief as witnesses to the aftermath of a tragedy. And all the while, we're attempting to prevent the aftermath from becoming a tragedy of its own. I'm sure people here who especially worked in clinical settings have had that fear of what it could mean to potentially lose a client to suicide or even an unfulfilled life, feeling like you might have not been able to do everything that you could. And so I encourage you to not deprive yourself of the opportunity to create too. It can be hard to find the time in our professions and in general, living in the kind of work obsessed society that we do, to find the time to do something like, let's say, illustration or learning an instrument, because those things are very, very time consuming, and it can take a long time to even learn how to do them. But that's where I think reframing what it means to be artistic is so important, and why I laid out the definitions that I did at the beginning of this presentation. If a change in circumstance is not currently possible, perhaps a change in our perspective is. And that goes for just about any issue we face at life, especially issues that bring us grief. Things as common as cooking a meal or decorating your space or having fun with the way you choose to approach a conversation, right? Wordplay, I would argue, ought to be viewed as forms of artistic expression. If art is at the core of human being, everything we do to communicate with one another is artistic. And this picture that I had on the side here, I just wanted to use as an example. Prior to moving to Colorado, I worked as a server at a handful of restaurants, and one of them that I worked at, there was a child with their parents who was drawing on just like the back of a kid's menu, and they left it there. And this is what they left, and I still have it up on my refrigerator. I don't know, I like cats, but I just, just a kid with a crayon who's bored, right? Who was doing this just because they could. Um, I was having a really bad day, and when I looked at this, it just, I don't know, for whatever reason, it made my day, even though it had nothing to do with me. And I wanted to put it in there because I think it serves as a reminder that the little things you create um, can give people hope, whether you realize it or not. Um, and I also want to point out that I often hear, even when I have held creative, like artistic workshops for like groups I ran during my time in casework. Um, I'm just not a creative person. I hear that all the time. Like, well, I'm just not very creative, and and that is no excuse. And it is an idea that is rooted in capitalism. Our society often warps the purpose of art as a means of facilitating parasociality, like through celebrity culture, or manufacturing consumable content. But art is not content. It doesn't matter if your art sucks, um, or if nobody ever sees it or even likes it. There's still something to learn from the process, especially when, like I mentioned before, we put forth the effort to reframe all of the little things that we do beyond the fine arts as being artistic. So you are, in fact, special. We all are. Um, yes, in some ways, all art is derivative, but that's because communication exchange is innate to human existence. We share ideas. We communicate things intentionally and unintentionally. We borrow ideas from others. But there is not a single other human being in a million lifetimes who will repeat an authentic and creative action in the exact same way that you do. That is, to me, precious. And so it makes me sad, and I wonder, why do so many of us stop ourselves from creating things? Given how unique our approach to expression can be, I have to wonder if each creative expression presents the opportunity to experience the exact same thing as though it were new every single time. There's always a little twist on it. And so if I had to summarize everything that I've argued here, it really would be that choosing to live an authentic life is the ultimate form of artistic expression. Everything you find meaningful, that you choose to make meaningful, that's contained within your life, your thoughts, your hopes, your dreams, your love, your losses, your dreams, everything is contained in this one life that you have. So consider what you will create. And for me personally, words were sort of my first love when it comes to artistic mediums, poetry especially. I love making music, but it's hard. So I just wanted to share this excerpt from a poem from one of my favorite authors. It's from T.S. Eliot, and the poem is called Little Getting. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time, through the unknown, remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree. not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard in the stillness between two waves of the sea.